Humanity suffers from a deeply ingrained, almost incurable psychological delusion. It is the arrogant, comforting belief that our accumulated wealth and our advanced technology can somehow shield us from the absolute unyielding laws of the natural world. We operate under the naive assumption that everything in the physical universe has a price tag. We believe that if we simply pay enough money, if we hire the right experts, and if we buy the most expensive equipment, we can instantly transform the most unforgiving, hostile, and lethal environments on Earth into comfortable, accessible tourist attractions. We treat the ancient, sleeping titans of the Earth as if they are mere amusement parks, waiting patiently to be conquered and photographed. But the universe is not a business, and nature does not accept currency. When the Earth decides to collect its debt, its cash register is filled entirely with human lives. This is not just a story about a mountain climbing disaster. This is the tragic, terrifying story of what happens when human hubris attempts to purchase the roof of the world. The year is 1996. The location is the absolute pinnacle of the Earth's crust, Mount Everest, Sagarmatha, Chomolungma. Rising majestically to an incomprehensible 29,029 feet, it is a geological cathedral of rock, ice, and screaming wind. For decades, Everest was a sacred, isolated temple of death. It was a brutal, unforgiving proving ground where only the most elite, highly trained, and deeply respectful professional mountaineers dared to tread. To climb Everest was to accept a profound, almost spiritual pact with mortality. But in the early 1990s, a subtle and highly dangerous shift occurred on the slopes of the mountain. This sacred, isolated peak was suddenly aggressively commercialized. A new breed of adventure companies realized that there was a massive, untapped market of extremely wealthy individuals who possessed an insatiable desire for ultimate bragging rights. These companies began to offer a terrifying promise to the global elite. They promised that for the astronomical price of $65,000, they could guide absolutely anyone, regardless of their actual climbing experience, safely to the summit of the world. It was the ultimate, intoxicating commodification of danger. It was the absolute zenith of human arrogance. By May of 1996, the base camp of Mount Everest had morphed into a chaotic, sprawling, high-altitude carnival. Among the dozens of expeditions attempting the summit that spring, two rival commercial groups stood out. They were led by two of the most experienced, legendary, and highly respected mountaineers on the planet, Rob Hall of Adventure Consultants and Scott Fisher of Mountain Madness. Hall and Fisher were brilliant climbers, but they were now trapped in a ruthless corporate competition. They needed to get their high-paying clients to the summit to secure their business reputations. And those clients were a wildly diverse, tragically ill-prepared group of dreamers. While some had decent climbing backgrounds, others were wealthy businessmen, doctors, and socialites who had barely spent any time on actual technical ice. These weren't hardened explorers who had dedicated their lives to the mountains. They were individuals who believed the peak could simply be paved with money. They arrived at the mountain draped in the most expensive neon jackets, breathing from imported oxygen tanks, armed with a $65,000 receipt. They relied entirely on a hidden army of Sherpas, the true, unsung titans of the Himalayas, to carry their heavy loads, set their ropes, and carve their steps. The wealthy clients were essentially paying to be dragged to the summit, wrapped in a comfortable cocoon of false achievement. They were buying the photograph, not the climb. They genuinely believed that their expensive tickets and their legendary guides had successfully insulated them from the terrifying realities of the mountain. But there is a geographical threshold on Mount Everest that completely ignores the contents of your bank account. An invisible atmospheric boundary located at 26,000 feet, 8,000 meters. Mountaineers refer to this altitude with a specific, highly accurate title, the Death Zone. It is not merely a dramatic nickname, it is an absolute biological reality. In the Death Zone, the human body is no longer capable of sustaining life. It is only capable of slowly, methodically dying. At this extreme altitude, acclimatization is a biological impossibility. You do not adapt to the death zone, you merely tolerate it until it kills you. The atmospheric pressure is so low that the oxygen level is a mere 1/3 of what exists at sea level. Every single step requires 3 gasping, desperate breaths. Your digestive system shuts down, rejecting food. Your muscles begin to rapidly atrophy, actively consuming their own protein just for fuel. Your blood literally begins to thicken, turning into a sluggish sludge that struggles to circulate through your freezing veins. As hypoxia severe oxygen deprivation sets in. Your brain begins to physically swell inside your skull. The most basic cognitive functions, the simple ability to make rational, logical decisions, rapidly evaporate. You're slowly, silently suffocating while fully awake. The extreme cold doesn't just freeze your skin, it numbs your very soul, whispering a seductive invitation to simply close your eyes, lay down in the soft snow, and go to sleep. This is exactly why the golden rule of Mount Everest dictates that you must never, under any circumstances, linger in the death zone. You push for the summit, you touch the top, and you immediately, desperately flee back down to the lower camps. The absolute, uncompromising deadline for this retreat is 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 2 p.m. If you have not reached the summit by 2 p.m., you must turn around. To disobey this rule is to actively court death. On the night of May 9th, moving into the early hours of May 10th, the summit push began. Dozens of climbers stepped out of their tents into the freezing, pitch-black night, turning their headlamps upward toward the peak. But the seeds of disaster had already been sown by the sheer volume of commercial ambition. As the sun rose over the Himalayas, a terrifying, fatal bottleneck occurred at one of the most dangerous sections of the climb, a narrow, nearly vertical rock face known as the Hillary Step. Picture the sheer madness of it, a precarious, jagged rock wall suspended thousands of feet above a bottomless, yawning void. Because so many inexperienced, slow-moving clients were on the mountain at the same time, a literal traffic jam formed in the death zone. Dozens of climbers, clipped onto a single fraying nylon rope, were forced to stand completely motionless. For over an hour, they waited in a deadly high-altitude bottleneck, shivering violently as the Arctic cold penetrated their expensive downsuits. Every wasted minute, standing still in that queue, was another molecule of oxygen stolen from their already depleted cylinders. The meticulous schedule of the climb completely shattered. The invisible ticking clock of the sacred 2 p.m. turnaround time arrived and passed. But the intoxicating lure of the summit deafened them to reason. The pressure of the $65,000 price tag was too heavy. Instead of forcing their exhausted, oxygen-deprived clients to turn around, the guides made a fatal, catastrophic compromise. They allowed the climb to continue deep into the late afternoon. By 3 o'clock, and even past 4 o'clock, exhausted climbers were still taking their final, agonizing steps to the summit. They stood on the roof of the world, weeping tears of joy, taking photographs, and celebrating their expensive triumph. They believed they had successfully conquered the Earth, but the Earth had merely lured them into a trap. As the late afternoon wore on, the mountain finally decided to collect its debt. Without any warning, the clear blue sky over Everest rapidly darkened, mutating into a bruised, ominous canopy of churning gray clouds. The barometric pressure plummeted. The wind began to howl with a demonic, deafening pitch. One of the most violent, aggressive, and merciless blizzards in the recorded history of Mount Everest suddenly slammed into the upper mountain. Hurricane-force winds exceeding 130 kilometers per hour aggressively ripped across the exposed ridges. The temperature plummeted to a mind-numbing -50°C. The swirling, blinding snow created an absolute, disorienting whiteout. Visibility was instantly reduced to absolute zero. Dozens of exhausted, hypoxia-addled climbers were now completely stranded at over 8,000 meters. They were caught in the very heart of the death zone, completely exposed to the absolute wrath of nature. Claustrophobia is a terror we normally associate with being trapped in small, dark, enclosed spaces. But on the slopes of Mount Everest, claustrophobia takes on a far more terrifying, psychological dimension. True claustrophobia is being trapped in a vast, endless white void, unable to see your own hands in front of your face. It is the horrific realization that you are entirely imprisoned inside your own failing biology. Your lungs are burning. Your brain is actively deceiving you. Your legs simply refuse to take another step. You are a helpless prisoner locked inside a freezing, dying body, surrounded by an infinite ocean of ice. In the blinding chaos of the storm, the commercial illusions of safety completely evaporated. The guided tour violently mutated into a primal, brutal fight for individual survival. Climbers wandered blindly through the howling blizzard, desperately searching for the safety of Camp 4, completely lost just a few hundred yards from their tents. As their bottled oxygen ran out, the horrific biological reality of hypoxia began to completely destroy their minds. Starved of oxygen and exposed to extreme hypothermia, the human brain begins to malfunction in the most terrifying, paradoxical ways. Several climbers, wandering lost in the freezing white void, began to experience a fatal psychological phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing. As their core body temperature plummeted toward death, their damaged nervous systems hallucinated a sensation of extreme burning heat. In the middle of a -50-degree blizzard, delirious climbers began to actively tear off their heavy down jackets. They ripped off their protective gloves and unzipped their suits, willingly exposing their bare flesh to the lethal freezing wind. They lay down in the deep snow, convinced they were burning alive, and peacefully surrendered to the ice. But the true lingering horror of the 1996 disaster was not merely physiological, it was deeply, tragically moral. Under the extreme alien conditions of the death zone, the fundamental rules of human empathy and civilization are violently erased. At 8,000 meters, you barely have enough oxygen to keep your own heart beating. Carrying the dead weight of another human being through a blizzard is not an act of heroism. It is a mathematical suicide pact. As the storm raged, the ultimate brutal reality of high-altitude survival became terrifyingly clear. You cannot save anyone in the death zone. Climbers who were still able to walk found themselves stumbling past the freezing, dying bodies of their own friends, their clients, and their teammates. They heard the desperate, slurred pleas for help echoing in the howling wind, but they could do absolutely nothing to stop. To try and lift a fallen comrade meant that you would simply die next to them. And so, operating on pure, cold reptilian survival instinct, they walked away. They stared with empty, snow-blinded eyes at the dying, and they continued down the mountain, leaving them to the absolute mercy of the storm. The laws of nature had entirely overwritten the moral codes of humanity. $65,000 tickets, prestigious corporate titles, and deep bank accounts were utterly meaningless on the South Col. Money could not buy a single molecule of oxygen. It could not purchase a degree of warmth. It could not save them from becoming permanent frozen statues in the ice. When you are stranded at 28,700 feet, the concept of a rescue operation is a childish fantasy. Helicopters cannot fly in air this thin. Your strongest guides are just as fragile, just as susceptible to the lethal hypoxia as you are. Throughout that horrific night and the following day, the mountain claimed its victims one by one. 8 people lost their lives in the storm, including the legendary, seemingly invincible guides, Rob Hall and Scott Fisher. Scott Fisher, exhausted and severely ill, collapsed on a high ridge, telling his team to leave him behind. He died alone in the snow. Rob Hall, a man who had safely guided dozens of people to the summit in previous years, found himself trapped in a mathematical certainty. He refused to abandon a severely struggling client named Doug Hansen near the south summit. Pinned down by the raging storm, completely out of supplemental oxygen, his hands and feet already solidifying into blocks of ice, Hall realized his fate was sealed. The mountain had stripped away his title, his business, and his legendary status, leaving only a freezing man staring into the void. In one of the most heartbreaking moments in the history of mountaineering, Hall was patched through via a satellite radio call to his pregnant wife, thousands of miles away in New Zealand. With his voice weak, freezing, and fading into the storm, he spoke his final, agonizing words of comfort. He told her not to worry too much. He told her to sleep well. And then he closed his eyes and allowed the mountain to silently claim him. Today, the bodies of Rob Hall, Scott Fisher, and many of their clients still rest exactly where they fell in 1996. The extreme altitude and freezing temperatures preserved them perfectly, transforming them into eternal tragic landmarks. For the climbers who pass them every year, they are permanent, silent monuments to the absolute limits of human ambition. The 1996 Everest disaster remains a profound, chilling lesson in humility. It proved to the world that Mount Everest is not a theme park. It is an ancient, indifferent, and lethally hostile environment. We cannot purchase dominance over the earth. We cannot bribe the atmosphere, and we cannot outsmart the freezing wind. The mountains tolerate our presence only for fleeting, insignificant moments. We approach them not as conquering masters, but merely as fragile, temporary guests, entirely dependent on their absolute mercy for fleeting, insignificant moments. The summit of the world belongs to the ice, the rock, and the void. Any allusion to the contrary is simply a $65,000 invitation to a frozen grave. History is not dead. It is never dead. It merely slumbers beneath the howling winds and the eternal white snows of our forgotten past, patiently waiting to be remembered by the arrogant generations that inevitably follow. We will meet again in the next era, when humanity once more forgets the terrifying silent warnings written in thin air and freezing ice. You're watching past Resurrected. Until the next era,